All right, so I'm going to start off talking about this word plague, which we've been hearing a lot of lately. And actually, I know there's somebody here who may even have better knowledge of this. So if you do, go ahead and put that in the chat too. But it comes from a Greek word meaning strike, which isn't very much like what we normally think of as the plague, but this idea of being hit, being smited or struck. Also in the Latin, related to words for both striking and a wound. So, you know, like being hit with a sword, again, being smited. Another word that we are going to talk about is epidemic. Now, this sounds much more sort of scientific, right? But it actually goes back to the early 17th century in French, and which, you know, not to say that that's not scientific, it is, but it has to do with this idea of a disease being somehow put upon, that prefix epi means upon, and demos, of course, means the people, you know, same root as democracy. So I want to draw attention to this because we're going to find that when we think about plagues and epidemics, we very quickly get to thinking about populations, about communities, about groups of people that are being struck by them. Another thing to note is, here's the definition from the CDC. So you'll note that it doesn't have some of the words you might expect. You might expect something about how many people die or how terrible the disease is. But an epidemic actually means that if normally you expect X number of cases, you have more than that. It's something about a sudden increase above the norm. So you can have a disease that is absolutely horrible and causes all kinds of devastation, but if it's not unexpected, we wouldn't call it an epidemic. The other thing is we could call something an epidemic that's not especially horrible, right? Like we could have an epidemic of, you know, lice or something like that if it was suddenly above what we would expect. So just a little bit of a disconnect between the way it's thought about in, you know, popular usage and the technical definition. So I want to talk a little bit at the beginning here about sorry, losing track of things again, about how epidemics fit into what is actually killing people in the world. So this comes from the WHO, and this is as of 2019, so we would see some changes this year, I think. But you'll notice that the things that are in green are communicable diseases, and infectious diseases are part of that group. So are things like foodborne illness. It's not all things that are contagious, but anything that comes kind of from a pathogen would be in the communicable diseases group. And there's only 3 in this group. Sorry, I've been asked to speak more slowly. I will try to do that. Thank you. So you'll notice that in this group of top 10 causes of death globally, there are only 3 that are communicable diseases. And one of those is neonatal conditions, which that's, you know, children dying right after they are born. So plagues, epidemics are not the biggest thing that are killing people worldwide. Even if we add COVID to that number 4 category, the lower respiratory infections, we still wouldn't have it anywhere close to heart disease as a something that kills people. So it's small, but it's dramatic, right? It's something that because it's unexpected, because, you know, we're kind of used to heart disease. We know what that looks like, as tragic as it is. But a plague, an epidemic, is something that's new and that that makes kind of an impact on us because of that. This is on the same theme, really. You'll notice it's from July. So if we updated this now, we would see that COVID would be right at the top. We're at about 10,000 deaths per day globally with COVID. So that would really change this chart. But the point I want to make here is you can have a lot of deaths, but we don't call it an epidemic if it is, again, not unusual. So tuberculosis, we don't say we have a tuberculosis epidemic, even though it's killing more people than almost anything else worldwide. And one question that I will put to you is, could this happen with COVID? Many of us will be able to get vaccinated, ideally, but some people won't. We may find that COVID becomes like the flu, that we see it go up and down every year. We see a lot of cases in the winter and go down in the summer, or whatever pattern it might be. It could continue to be a source of deaths even after it's an epidemic. And this is, again, putting things in perspective. I love this graphic. It actually comes from Forbes magazine. They produced it. And this is a good way to show how what we're going through now compares to some of these plagues from history. I have noticed that my college students are obsessed with the Black Death. That's what they want to talk about. And, for good reason, because you will see that it just overwhelms every other disease we see here. 200 million deaths. And that actually may be short, because it's listing it as 1347 to 1351. But if you look at the Black Death in Europe, it went on for about 300 years. It just kept reinfecting different countries and killing up to half the population in some places, spreading from place to place. So it just killed more people than anything else, any other contagious disease has ever killed. And also in a dramatic and painful and horrible way. So one that supports going back to and looking at in many ways. And there's some great literature actually based on this. You'll see that the second biggest ball there is the smallpox, which we don't hear much about now. It's one of the diseases we consider to have eradicated, though it does still exist in the world. We'll talk a little bit more about smallpox later. And Spanish flu, which we have been hearing a lot about as a comparison to COVID. You'll see that killed 40 to 50 million people in 1918 to 19. Along with HIV/AIDS, which killed slightly less than that, although that's ongoing. Those are the big epidemics of the modern era. COVID, again, this is an old chart. I think this is from March. So COVID now would be, I wrote this down. Right now we're at about 2.6 million deaths from COVID worldwide. So you'd see it still doesn't compare with something like HIV/AIDS or the Spanish flu in terms of how many deaths there are. But again, it's ongoing. We'll see where it ends up. You can also notice that things that get a lot of attention, like Ebola, are actually quite a lot smaller than some of these other things here. All right, moving on to the concepts that we're talking about here. So this is what I think we mean when we use these words, plague and epidemic. So again, with a plague, you have the sense of being struck, often by a higher power when we're looking at this in history. This idea that something comes from outside or above and strikes you, wounds you, possibly as a punishment for something that you did as an individual, something that your monarch did as an individual representing the populace, for social corruption. I don't know, many of you will remember that this is something people would say about HIV/AIDS, that it was a punishment to the society for corruption. We still have this idea floating around in our culture. Plague kind of conjures up something mysterious, right? And how are you going to deal with a plague? Well, maybe you should pray. Maybe you should really think about your sins. Maybe you should do some kind of cleansing or atonement. Those are the ways you might approach a plague. There's also a sense of tragedy, that it's something that happens to people, and the things that you do to try to intervene may make it worse, may not help. So it sort of represents the futility of human effort in trying to do what we want to do. Epidemic, on the other hand, as we said, the word includes in it that it includes a population, a demos, a people. So we're not talking about individuals as much, and maybe not even about communities. but rather a population in kind of a larger sense. When we talk about epidemic, it will highlight where the individual is in the social body. So this is something that's very familiar to all of us right now, right? The question of whether we as individuals wear our masks and social distance and follow other guidelines has a lot of ramifications for the people around us, for whether schools can open, right? For whether the economy functions. So an epidemic brings this to light, that we're not just individuals making decisions. We're part of this bigger picture that we may or may not want to be, but our actions are affecting that. And the bigger picture is affecting our actions. So when we talk about epidemics, we usually assume that it's a scientifically defined thing, right? That scientists have said, we're in an epidemic now. Somebody has certified it as an epidemic, as a pandemic, as, you know, whatever it is. And that to approach it, you're not going to pray, or you can, you know, that people may make that choice, but we usually assume that an epidemic is something that you need people in the government, people in the WHO, people on a policy level to address. And also, as I said, it's going to point out things about a society, right? As we're seeing now, where we have inequities in our healthcare system, those are really coming to the fore as this epidemic ravages our land. So this is just a way to kind of keep these terms in play. They're obviously related, but have different valences. All right, so if you have any time on your hands, I highly recommend going and checking out Google Trends. If any of you have done that before, it's really fun to see how these things change over time. For me, I don't know if it's fun for everybody. So this is just showing how many people have searched for these terms since, you know, the start of Google. And you'll notice a spike, right? So in terms of how many people are searching for plague and epidemic. And that spike happens the week of March 8th to 14th, 2020, which is almost exactly a year ago. So it's an interesting moment to be thinking about this as it's really kind of an anniversary for a lot of us of when this all started, at least in our experience. Now we can look even farther back. Google will also do a search of how often terms appear in books, in all of the books within Google Books. So then you can go all the way back to 1500 and see some of these kind of really interesting peaks. You notice, this is books in English, by the way. So when London gets a plague, we get a huge spike, right, in the 17th century. I'm also interested in how the word plague was, of course, so much more popular over a lot of time. In fact, I have no idea where that epidemic is coming from in 1550. But, you know, since the mid-19th century, the terms have kind of been going back and forth in usage. And you'll notice, again, a spike around the 1918 flu for the word epidemic. That may be where it kind of came into a lot of people's popular usage. We notice a spike in the 80s for the word plague. I think that's probably related to the AIDS epidemic. So it's interesting just to look at how these words are used over time. And now it's, I was sort of surprised to see that plague has become a more popular word than epidemic as of the late 20th century. Sorry, 21st, whatever century we're in now. All right, so now we're going to go back to history and prehistory, in fact. So we start here with the plagues of Exodus. So I have one quote here. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. So why don't you just go ahead and put in the chat, which ones do you remember? What are the plagues? I'm interested to hear which people are familiar with. There are 10, right? Locusts, yes, we all remember the locusts and the frogs. Actually, Trisha, I think you put that in the marketing, right? So people are prompted for that. Primed. Pestilence. Is there a plague of pestilence? Maybe. Pestilence is another word, actually, that you could put into those Google searches. It's another word that's used for plague. Boils, killing of the firstborn, yep. Darkness. Nobody's got the river of blood yet, I don't think. Great. So yeah, so basically the story here is that the people of Israel are enslaved in Egypt, and their God, in order to help them become free, smites the people of Egypt with these plagues so that they will be released. And if you read this part of Exodus, it's interesting because after each of the plagues, or after many of the plagues, it will say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he refused to let them go, so that God could show his own power, could show how much he could do to them, basically. So the Egyptians kind of were in a rough spot because God kind of wouldn't let them do what they needed to do to get rid of the plagues. But it's an example of this idea of there's a certain people who are being punished by a God for a certain purpose. And, there's a lot of collateral damage there, right? So Pharaoh's making his decisions, but there's a lot of Egyptians who are losing their firstborn children as a result. So this is sort of the thing most of us think of when, I think, when we hear the word plague. We go back to these plagues of Egypt and, just the worst things that could possibly happen to you, right? You're an agricultural society. You have locusts eating up your crops. You have the livestock being killed. Your water turns into blood. So just like the worst things that can possibly happen as punishment for the thing that you're doing. By the way, this is an image from an 1890 edition of the Bible, which I think I just liked it as an image, to be honest. I don't have an image from, the original because we don't have that. All right, so here's another plague for you. Now, I think everybody's probably heard of Oedipus. You may or may not associate it with a plague unless, you've spent some time studying the classics. So the story of Oedipus is that, so as you may remember, Oedipus ends up killing his father at a crossroads. He shows up in Thebes. He becomes the king. And eventually he's going to learn that he killed his own father and is married to his own mother. But he doesn't know that at the beginning of the story. And so, but what happens is there's this plague that's killing everybody. Now, the play is set probably in the 13th century BCE, but it was written and first performed in 429 BCE. So, it's a historical play. It's about the ancient past of that time. And you should note too that the plague of Athens happened in 430 BCE, so a year before this. So Sophocles is writing this play in the context of a city that has just had about a quarter of its population die from a plague. So they know about plagues. So that's the setting here. And so when we start the play, the city is suffering from this terrible, terrible disease. And they go to the oracle to find out what's causing this disease. The oracle says, there's a corrupt person in your city that needs to be cast out before you can be healed. And of course, Oedipus vows to find the corrupt person, and then lo and behold, it is himself all along. This is the essence of tragedy. He learns the truth about himself. He has to be exiled, and then the city can be healed. So again, there's this idea of corruption and of, you need to kind of cleanse your city, your population, your society before you can be healed. All right, jumping ahead quite a bit to the Black Plague. And this is just another take on it. You know what? There can be kind of some fun that you can make out of a plague. So the Decameron is a work written by Boccaccio in Florence around 1350. Now we're in 80. We're in the Common Era now. There had been a plague. The Black Plague had hit Florence in the late 1340s. So again, he's writing about recent history here. And if you read the introduction to the Decameron, it describes how people reacted to this. So some people got very strict and said, you have to, only eat bread and water, and you have to be extremely moral and have very regular habits. Other people just partied, right? They're like, the world is ending. There are no rules. Let's just drink and have a good time. So what the Decameron is a collection of stories. One of the groups, this fictional group, decides that they're all going to go hang out in a villa and tell stories to pass the time. And then the stories are the book. They're love stories. So this is happening at the beginning of the Black Plague that's going to wipe out Europe for 300 years. But out of this, and this is actually really part of what Boccaccio says, is out of this terrible experience, we're going to make some lightness and joy and art and pleasure and kind of keep ourselves human that way. So this has to do with the humanism that comes out of this time. So moving on to, jumping up to the 18th, I guess we're at the late 16th century here. Smallpox in the Americas. So this quote comes from Thomas Harriot, who was sort of a scout for England. He came over to see, is this a good place where we should, try to set up some commercial colonies? Would that be a good idea? As you know, the answer they came up with was yes. But he wrote this report, and it has these kind of amazing images in it. This is actually, is this an image from the report? Sorry, I have to check my notes if this is one of them. It is not an image from his report, actually. This is a 16th century Aztec drawing of smallpox victims. So as you may have heard, when Columbus and other explorers came to the New World, they brought diseases with them unintentionally, which really wiped out the native populations, which had no resistance to them, and they were unfamiliar diseases. So as you can see from this quote, the way that the native populations understood what was happening was kind of interesting. They imagined it as imaginary bullets that were being shot from these newcomers into their bodies, and then they would, die of them. Now, we should note that this is through the words of Thomas Harriot, who is one of these explorers, and he describes how the indigenous people would say, oh, well, this is so that we can see that these newcomers are like, they're like gods. They're stronger than us. They're, their gods are kind of clearing the way for them to come. That's obviously kind of self-serving, right? Like that it's helpful for the English people to believe that the gods are clearing the way from them. And we do see this in the writings of the Pilgrim settlements. So about 90% of some communities had been wiped out by the time they arrived. And the colonists did interpret this as God's will that they should have the land. So if you look at William Bradford's Plymouth Plantation writings, for example, they find this cache of corn in a deserted village, which they interpret as a special providence of God to keep them alive through the winter. So it kind of depends on whose perspective you're taking, is whether this is a special providence of God or just a really tragic effect of this colonization. And then this is actually just a piece of art that I thought was kind of interesting. So as many of you will know, smallpox was weaponized. So at first, of course, it's unintentional that this is killing people. It was intentionally weaponized, at least in a couple of cases. We have letters from this General Amherst in 1763 that say, hey, why don't we send some infected blankets to indigenous people? And there was an outbreak of smallpox shortly after that letter. There isn't a ton of evidence that this was carried out very often, but it was an idea that was circulated and spoken about. That this is a way we can attack the native populations with this disease that we know they don't have any resistance to. So this piece of art is from 1995. This is still a very important moment in the history of some native peoples. So next, this is a much more amusing image, I'm sure. So we have a turning point kind of at the end of the 18th century where we can move from thinking about plagues, the plague of smallpox, toward a more modern conception of disease. And what really makes that turning point is inoculation. So inoculation in the Americas goes back to the early 18th century, the 1720 smallpox epidemic in Boston there was an inoculation movement there. In Asia and Africa, inoculation goes back way, way further. And that's actually, it came to Boston via an enslaved person who told Cotton Mather, who owned him, about the practice of inoculation in Africa. And Mather was a proponent of it in Boston, to much controversy. So you can see that the anti-vax movement goes back a long way. So if you can read at the bottom here, it says the cowpox, or the wonderful effects of the new inoculation, a publication of the Anti-Vaccine Society of 1802. So this vaccination is the new inoculation. And those of you who are attentive to word origins may have noticed that vaccine comes from the word for cow. And the amazing technology there is they were able to take cowpox, which does not kill humans, give it to humans, and then they would be inoculated against smallpox. So it was much, much safer than giving them actual smallpox, which was how it had been done before that. So it's this kind of amazing breakthrough as we now consider it. But at the time, the idea that you would take an animal disease and on purpose give it to a person was, really upsetting to some people. So you can see this imagining of people growing, cows' body parts, horns and snouts and things because they've been inoculated. So this was early anti-vaccine propaganda. Which, if you know any anti-vaxxers, you could share this with them. They could probably use it today. All right, so the big themes that we've had here are this idea of punishment, that it's a crucible. It's something that is going to test your society, that's going to tell you something that you didn't know before about the way you really are. There's the theme of corruption, of contamination, of being dirty. We also learn about social entanglement. You can't be alone in a plague, right? You're gonna be mixed together with your neighbors, whether you like it or not. And then also the social shakeup. It's gonna change things. When there's a big disease, important people die, less important people become important. Rules change. Unscrupulous people take advantage of opportunities, people become heroes. There's all this kind of, churning of the society that happens during these things, as we're seeing now. So now I'm going to jump right from there to the present day in a way that you may not expect. So here we have a couple of images from recent cultural works, which you may be familiar with. On the left, we have The Walking Dead, which is a long-running TV show about zombies. And on the right, we have Twilight, which is a series of books and movies about vampires. So what does this have to do with the plague? Well, zombies and vampires are kind of widely recognized to be ways that fears about these very things we've been talking about, contamination, corruption, contagion, social issues are expressed in art and literature. So zombies in particular tend to be associated with social diseases. There's a big zombie panic at moments where there is fear of communism, right? That just like zombies will kind of overrun people and eat their brains. This sort of represents what our fear is of other kind of political organizations. It represents mindlessness, right? Lack of consciousness. It's also, though, associated with consumerism. Some of the earliest zombie movies, Dawn of the Dead, for example, takes place in a mall, right? So it's sort of about this like mindless consumerism that's taking over. Vampires, on the other hand, arose at a time when a lot of people were dying of tuberculosis, which was also called consumption at the time. And it was called a wasting disease. People would get very thin and they'd have kind of like pale faces. It was actually people were considered to be very beautiful when they were dying of consumption. And then, you know, people start writing about vampires, this idea that what's really going on here is somebody's coming and actually sucking your blood, right? So again, there's this fear of contamination, that there's things lurking around you that can corrupt and contaminate you, and then you become somebody who is corrupted and contaminated. And then to go out a little more broadly, these are some other ways that we've been talking of, that we use these words, epidemic and plague. And so they're used kind of as metaphors and kind of literally a lot of the time. So these, I think, are probably all pretty familiar, you know, but I think it's interesting to look at what we think might be contagious, what we think might be, might represent the corruption in our society. What, you know, why would we call loneliness an epidemic exactly? It's certainly a problem, but what does it mean to call it an epidemic, right? We have heard so much about the opioid epidemic, and I think that does have to do with how quickly it has just skyrocketed in terms of the number of deaths. We have a plague of fake news. We have a plague of systemic racism. Obesity epidemic, you know, has been talked about for years. So at this point, I'm going to ask you again here for your contributions. What do you think we're suffering from a plague of? I mean, COVID, obviously, so we can sort of put that aside for now. But in terms of something that's maybe not a disease, what does our society suffer from a plague of? See, messing with my screen here. Disinformation, right? Yeah, that's a pretty common one. Distrust, cancel culture. Yeah, these are really interesting. Just people are writing kind of really fundamental things of like empathy, divisiveness, intolerance, just lots of disinformation in there. Cynical bunch. Liz has written that we're a cynical bunch tonight, but I did ask you this question. I mean, I'm not sure that you would say we have a plague of, you know, rainbows. I think there actually, somebody said that the government in Japan might have recently appointed a minister of loneliness. I think that might have happened in the UK as well. It's definitely been talked about in a few places. Oh, I love these ideas. Wow. Food deserts. That's interesting. Meanness, self-interest. Great. Well, thank you for these answers. And we can talk a bit about them in the Q&A if you'd like to. All right, I'm going to just, I'm going to end my presentation and then we'll go on to Q&A, but I just wanted to tell you, if you are interested in this topic, I'm going to give you my top 5 plague books in case you would like to explore them. So you've probably heard of The Plague. You know, you have to mention The Plague in your top 5 plague books by Albert Camus, written in the 1940s. And it's a book where it's about a disease. It's about a plague that strikes a city in Algeria for about a year. But it's also an allegory for the occupation of France by the Nazis that Camus was living through. when he started this book. So it's a lot about resisting this disease as a metaphor for resisting other kinds of evil in the world. It's a great book. Jose Saramago's Blindness, I'm actually teaching this right now, is a book about a plague of blindness. Everybody goes blind. And the first group of people to go blind are put in an insane asylum, an empty insane asylum, basically quarantined there, which doesn't work. Everybody still gets it. But it's about what happens to those people in quarantine. And it really emphasizes the social aspects, right? So that plagues tell us something about ourselves and our society and what will happen in these kind of crucible situations. It's not a really cheerful book, I'll warn you. More cheerful is Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which is a play. You can also get it as a mini series on HBO, I think, which is about the AIDS epidemic and the it's sort of it takes place right before AIDS activism really gets off the ground, which sounds very depressing, but it's lovely and humorous and fun and beautiful. Definitely worth seeing or reading if you can. Ling Ma's Severance is a recent book, came out in 2018, and it's about a disease that comes from China and in some ways it really predicts so many things that happened for real in 2019, 2020. It describes the emptying out of New York as this plague hits and so on. So it's worth reading just to kind of gawk at, like, wow, this is predicting a lot of things that really happened, but it's also just a good book. And then for nonfiction, Elizabeth Fenn's Pox Americana. I love smallpox. I could talk about smallpox for another half an hour if you wanted me to, but it really gets into how important smallpox and then the vaccine for smallpox were in the establishment of the United States. So highly recommend that one as well. And I thank you for putting your own recommendations in the chat. Yeah, I see Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. I don't know the second one there. William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows, The Speckled Monster. Oh yeah, Guns, Germs, and Steel is great. Oh yeah, Pose is awesome also. Yeah, so keep putting your suggestions in the chat. Yeah, I really like Book of Wonders. That's a good one about the Black Plague. Somebody actually just gave me one called Hamnet. I haven't read it yet, but that's another Black Plague one. Interesting. Okay, so at this point, we're just going on to the Q&A. So I'm going to stop my share. And I will say that if you put something in the chat earlier, there was a lot of stuff in the chat, so I may not have seen it. So you might need to repeat if there's something you want me to answer. So Trisha, I'm going to let you take over moderating that.
Hey, hi everybody. You can put your questions in the chat. I did see some earlier that I want to get back to. I'm trying to find them in the chat. Oh, Carol from Newcastle said that she works at the Historical Society there and she's finding old documents on the smallpox epidemic on Newcastle in the late 1700s.
That's so
really
cool.
Interesting.
Do you want to share anything about that? Anything that you found that's really exciting?
Carol White, if you're in the chat, you can tell us more. You can also use the raise hand feature at any time, and that'll pop you up to the top of my screen if you want to ask a question. Liz said she's interested in recurring patterns of epidemics, recently comparing COVID and the 1918 flu.
Liz, what patterns are you thinking about or would you like to hear about? Without more, I'll say, so one of the reasons that the 1918 flu seems very similar is that it's something that, it's a respiratory infection. It's something that some people are fine and other people just, it affects them really badly. Unlike COVID, the 1918 flu, the people who are most affected were young people as well as older people. We're seeing just the older people side of that with COVID, fortunately. I shouldn't say fortunately, but better than both, I suppose. Oh, people can't unmute. I guess that's why people aren't answering us.
Oh, you have to raise your hand, use the raise hand feature to
Okay.
unmute.
Okay.
We had a question from Marina in the chat. She says, I've never heard about the Russian flu 1889 to 1890. Could you please share some more details? I think that was on one of your early slides.
It was on the slide, and I honestly really don't know anything about the Russian flu either. Sorry to say.
Then we all have a homework assignment.
Oh yeah, so Carol,
I see Carol's got her hand up. I'm gonna unmute you, Carol.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, great. Tell us about it.
Newcastle and smallpox.
Yes, we found a very interesting document in the town archives. A man had gotten smallpox and he was being quarantined in his home with his family. And if he dared to step foot outside the door, they were going to post a guard there 24 hours a day to make sure he stayed in his house.
Wow.
His relatives or his wife's relatives who lived nearby had been visiting. So they had the option to either quarantine in their house under the same rules or to go and get vaccinated. So according to your talk, it probably was cowpox that they would have been given, I guess. This was about 1792.
No, I think cowpox, when was Jenner? I feel like that probably was the smallpox inoculation, which was actual smallpox, where they would scrape, I don't want to get too graphic, but they would scrape the sores of an infected person and then use a needle to scrape it into an uninfected person. And I don't actually think doctors entirely understand why this is, but the infection that people would get from that, they would get smallpox, but it wouldn't be nearly as fatal. It did kill some people, there are people who died of the inoculation, but it was a much lower risk than getting it just in the course of, if there was an epidemic. So a lot of people did choose to take that risk. But again, you're taking the risk of death for a disease that you don't have yet. And also people would be contagious after getting the inoculation. So there was actually a lot of social resistance to it because, wealthier people were more able to get these inoculations. So they'd be kind of walking around contagious and infecting people who were less wealthy. So there was, there was one case where an inoculation hospital was burned down. There were these anti-inoculation mobs. I mean, there's a very interesting history there. But also the thing about, you mentioned being sort of imprisoned in their house. I was just thinking, did anybody hear that story about a couple months ago on a Maine island? I think it might have been Vinyl Haven or something like that, where there were some out-of-staters who came to spend time, I guess, in their summer house, and the locals cut down a tree so that they were trapped in their house because they thought that they should be quarantined. I mean, we're not that far, I guess, is what I'm saying from that moment. Oh, and yes, I love talking about Abigail Adams and inoculation. She had some really great letters about it and how scary it is, right? And also how important.
Thanks, Carol, for sharing that. I'll look out for that research and we'll keep an eye on and see if we can find out more about it, about what happened in Newcastle, because that's an interesting part of New Hampshire history. So we've got a question from Monica, who says she's interested in how epidemics and race and ethnicity and nationality have been linked. For example, in the US, Jewish people and tuberculosis, the Irish and cholera, etc.
Yeah, well, as I'm sure many of you know, there's almost always an association of a new disease with some with some group of people that is seen as from away. There's kind of amusing examples of it. If you look at syphilis in the 18th century, I think I'm not going to get all the details right here. You can look it up, but in England, it was known as the French pox. In France, it was known as, la pox anglaise or something like that. In another place, it was the Polish disease. In another place, it's the Spanish disease. It's sort of, it gets associated with whatever country you're mad at the time. And if you look at almost any record of an epidemic, at the beginning of it, there will be people saying, oh, this came from the East. This came from this other place. Now, often that's true. Epidemics do circulate along trade routes, right? So if things are being imported from a particular place, that is likely to be where the epidemic comes from. But that isn't enough to explain the way that the sort of sense of contamination and corruption gets put onto a group of people. And again, those are people who are somehow seen to be other or different, and results in, as we've seen, anti-Asian racism during this pandemic. You mentioned a couple other examples. So it's, I think, because they just cause so much fear, and people kind of tend to project fear onto other groups of people. It's a really unfortunate effect of epidemics that they tend to create social resistance against groups of people.
So Nicole asks in the chat, what does all of this information tell you about the experience of COVID that we might not have noticed?
Oh, wow, that's a really big question.
Good
okay, so, I remember thinking at the beginning of COVID, this isn't a great answer actually, but, that there was sort of a sense at the beginning that it was all, we'd get over it pretty quickly. And I was like, I've read so many of these plague books, and they always say that at the beginning, like, we'll be back to normal in a month. That's never true. And in fact, we are not back to normal, and we'll never be back to normal, right? So I think I have just been a little bit more aware of these things. It's like, yes, this is pointing out the problems in our society, and it's so many of the things that have happened during COVID are very familiar if you've looked at these other diseases. Like, you almost always have some kind of social unrest or riots. You almost always have some kind of conflict between the idea of individual responsibility and individual freedom and social responsibility. I don't know, I mean, that was really ramped up in this particular one. You almost always have some association of the disease with a group of people. There is the sense of, how does it travel? Like, how is it moving from place to place? And that seems to represent somehow something about the society. It showed us how much we are in each other's spaces, right? Like, how much we are sharing commercial spaces in particular, right? That we suddenly are recognizing the essential nature of certain workers that we didn't before. So I think I've just been a little bit more attuned to those things that have been pretty common in these other diseases. But I don't know that I have any special insight, because, this is new for me too, right? New for all of us.
We've got a question from Pete in the chat. He asks, what causes epidemics to stop? Many reasons, I assume, but was there a fairly common reason that the plague died out?
The plague didn't die out for a really long time. So, and as somebody I think just put in the chat, it does still exist. There are still cases of plague. It can be treated with antibiotics, and also we don't have as many rats and fleas running around in most places, so it's not, an epidemic anymore. But so some of this has to do with the way viruses evolve. If you imagine it from the virus's perspective, what works really well is to infect somebody and then keep them alive, so they go spreading it around. So you may see mutations that happen that make things more contagious but less fatal. So I think that has happened with plenty of diseases, that, as I said before, kind of with the flu, for example, like, a lot of people get it, some people die from it, but we don't consider that an epidemic because it happens every year. So others have been, somebody just put yellow fever in the chat. Yellow fever, a lot of the reason that we don't suffer from it anymore is because we filled a bunch of swamps and there's not as many mosquitoes around, right? So it can have to do with kind of environmental changes. I think people develop resistance and tolerance. We develop treatments. So I don't know that there's one answer, but it's kind of, a lot of literature about epidemics or movies and things will be things that just kill everybody off right away. That's actually not good for viruses. Like, if they kill everybody off, they have no other way to kind of grow and replicate. So so we probably will see it become less dangerous over time.
We have time for a couple more questions. So Jolene in the chat asked if you could talk more about the bubonic plague.
Everybody likes the bubonic plague. Well, the bubonic plague was terrible. I don't know if you know what it looked like, but it involved people would get these, they're called buboes, which are these huge swellings that are often described as black. I don't know if they really were black, but I think that's why it's called the Black Plague. But they would get them especially under the armpits, sometimes in the neck, places where you have lymph nodes. Would get these huge swellings, and then would just die in agony. And I think it, sorry, I just lost track of what I was going to say. So it spread, as you may know, in fleas, which is one of the reasons I think it could keep going for so long. As I was just saying, if it killed off that many hosts, it wouldn't continue. But if it's being spread by fleas, it doesn't really matter if the host dies. The flea can then carry it to the next host. And it also was really associated with the growth of global shipping and trading and marketing, so that often the fleas were being carried in clothing or in lace or in things that are being shipped from one place to another. So that's why it kind of hit all of Europe, though originally coming from somewhere in the East. I don't know, what else do you want? Oh, somebody has put all kinds of stuff about the plague in here. Oh no, sorry, this is about iconography, not about the plague. So yeah, I guess I'll stop with that now. Get maybe one more question.
I think also people associate all of the art and literature that comes out of like, especially the Renaissance, with the plague. I think that's part of what makes it so interesting for people too, is thinking about some things that we still think of visually in our culture, like memento mori,
Right.
and things like that.
So, right. Yeah, the idea that you always have to know that death could strike you at any time, right? It literally could. So yeah, you have that the whole idea of art that comes out of that.
Question from KC in the chat. Have there been other epidemics in which children have generally resisted the pathogen compared to the elderly and infirm?
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, we often see that kind of the two-pronged, that vulnerability is often the youngest and the oldest people. I'm sure there are others where that hasn't been the case. And of course, we know of some where it hits children in particular. Children are especially vulnerable. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
A question from John in the chat. He asks, in the end, will bugs win? Do we have a chance? Are humans that resilient?
Well, I mean, yes, the bugs are going to win. But which bugs is the question. Evolution works pretty well in a lot of cases. And I think that humans have been evolving in relation to diseases since humans have existed, as have bugs, to be honest. And some of that has been altered by modern medicine, by antibiotics, by other ways that we've tried to intervene. But I kind of suspect it's not going to be epidemics that kill us off. It's my theory, my personal theory.
I mean, there's a lot of other takers there, global warming, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? So I'm going to put a link in the chat because we've done a few talks. We had a talk on the yellow fever epidemic, and so we had a series on this. So I'm putting the link to that in the chat, and this video will go up in there too, just exploring epidemics from humanities perspectives with historians from UNH, from Dartmouth, in this series. So there's a couple other talks you might find interesting and resources on that link too. Kate, any last thoughts?
Just thank you all so much for coming and spending your Friday evening on Zoom with us. It's great to see so many people. And I really appreciate all that you put in the chat and how much engagement you've brought to this. Thank you.
Yes, so I want to thank everyone on behalf of New Hampshire Humanities. You can learn more about our work and find info about our upcoming talks on our website, nhhumanities.org. You can also subscribe to our email newsletter, Human Ties, while you're on our website, and you can find information about supporting our work on our website as well. So after tonight's program, you will get an email with a link to take a survey. We appreciate your feedback, and we hope you'll join us for upcoming programs. Someone in the chat asked about that book list. I'll make sure to put that up along with the video too. So thank you everyone very much and have a good night. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you.